never asked to be afraid. But fear has a way of finding you, especially when it's been whispering in your ear since childhood. Not the kind that comes from experience, but the kind that slips into your soul through headlines, jokes, angry voices on television, and silence at the dinner table. That kind of fear isn't loud. It's slow. It doesn't knock. It seeps in. And before you know it, you're looking at people, real, breathing, living people as shadows of something you were told to avoid. He grew up in a world where Islam was a word said with clenched teeth, where the sound of Arabic was met with suspicion, and the sight of a headscarf could turn a room cold. Nobody had to sit him down and teach him to hate. It was more subtle than that. It was in the way teachers skipped over Muslim holidays like they didn't matter, and the way television villains always seemed to pray before pulling the trigger, in the awkward silence when someone mentioned the word mosque. It wasn't about facts, it was about feeling, and the feeling was, stay away. He didn't know a single verse of the Quran, never shook the hand of a man who prayed 5 times a day, but he carried opinions like they were earned. He believed what was handed to him, like most people do, because digging deeper takes effort. Questioning what you've been told takes courage, and most of the time, ignorance is more comfortable than truth. Still, deep down, there was always a tension. Something didn't sit right, because hatred, even when it's dressed in patriotism or pride, still feels heavy. He'd see news reports of chaos in faraway countries and think, see, that's who they are. But then he'd pass by a Muslim neighbor, polite, quiet, always saying hello, and that same certainty would falter. He'd hear a Muslim coworker talking about family, or kindness, or patience, and something inside would whisper, this doesn't match what you believe. But that whisper was drowned out, because listening would mean letting go of what he thought he knew, and letting go is hard. You see, ignorance isn't just a lack of knowledge, it's a shield. It keeps you from having to change, from having to admit you might have been wrong. And for some, that's more frightening than anything else. But life has a way of breaking down walls. Not with a crash, but with a crack. A slow leak of truth that begins to flood the mind. It often starts with one encounter, one moment that doesn't fit the narrative. One stranger who doesn't behave the way the stereotype says they should. And in that moment, fear starts to lose its grip. Not because the facts have changed, but because the humanity has entered the room. He didn't realize how tightly he had been holding on to the fear until it began to slip away. Until he looked in the eyes of a man he was supposed to mistrust and saw nothing but calm, nothing but sincerity. That's the thing about real faith. It doesn't have to speak loudly to be heard. It lives in action, in patience, in quiet strength. And when you've lived your life surrounded by noise, that kind of silence hits different. So the fear, it was never really his. It was borrowed, inherited, injected by a world too lazy or too afraid to seek understanding. And now, for the first time in his life, he was ready to return it, ready to open the door to something else. Truth, curiosity, peace. Because fear rooted in ignorance can only survive in darkness. And now, the light was starting to break in. It was just another ordinary day. The kind of day that passes without Memorial Grey Tuesday with traffic, lukewarm coffee, and the usual routine. He stood in line at the post office, half scrolling through his phone, half cursing how slow everything felt. That's when he noticed him. The man stood out, but not in the way he expected. There was something unusually calm about him, composed, present. He wore a simple white shirt, neat beard, and a small cap on his head. Muslim, clearly. And just the sight of him triggered something old, buried, automatic, a stiffness in the shoulders, a flicker of tension behind the eyes. He didn't know this man, but his body reacted like it did, like it had been trained to. They exchanged nothing at first, just occupied the same space, breathing the same air. But sometimes the most life-altering moments begin in silence. A dropped envelope changed everything. It slipped from his hands, scattered papers like dry leaves on a windy street. He cursed under his breath, bent down quickly, hoping no one noticed, but the man already had. Without hesitation, the stranger knelt down, gathering pages carefully, respectfully, not even blinking when he saw the content, some legal stuff, personal things. He smiled. "You dropped this." That's all he said. No sermon, no small talk. Just 4 words delivered with warmth that felt unfamiliar, but welcome. And in that moment, the weight of assumption started to shift. "Thanks," he muttered awkwardly, not quite meeting his eyes. But the man didn't move away. He looked at him, really looked. Not with suspicion, not with defensiveness, with something softer, like he had nothing to prove, nothing to hide. They left the post office at the same time, walked out side by side, like fate had tethered them for just a little longer. The man commented on the weather. Nothing profound, just that it was unusually cool for that time of year. A small thing, but what struck him was how at ease the man seemed in his own skin, like he carried peace in his back pocket. "You from around here?" the stranger asked, as naturally as someone asking the time. "Yeah," he replied, "born and raised." The man smiled again. "I moved here a few years ago, still getting used to some of the rhythms." Something about the way he said rhythms made him chuckle. It was the first time he laughed near a Muslim and felt no guilt, no caution. They talked for a few more minutes about traffic, the best local place to get shawarma, even sports. It was simple, easy, but every second chipped away at something he hadn't even realized was there. He asked the man's name. "Yusuf," he said. He nodded. Didn't say much more, but the name echoed. He didn't know it then, but that encounter would unravel everything, because Yusuf didn't try to convert him, didn't try to debate. He just was kind, grounded, human, and that was what he had never been told, that Muslims were human. Not headlines, not statistics, not villains in a story written by someone who never met them. As Yusuf walked away, he turned back once just to wave. And for the first time in a long time, the man waved back without hesitation, without fear. And it hit him quietly but deeply. If one man could undo years of fear in 5 minutes, maybe the fear was never real to begin with. He couldn't stop thinking about it. That moment, that man, that smile. It haunted him not like a nightmare, but like a truth he could no longer ignore. The encounter with Yusuf should have been forgettable, a footnote in an average day. But instead, it followed him home, sat with him in the quiet, lingered behind his eyes as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling. It was in the silence between television commercials, in the spaces between his thoughts. He didn't know why, not at first, but something had shifted subtly and irreversibly. He'd grown up with a strong sense of right and wrong, at least that's what he believed. You trust your parents, your teachers, your pastors, your country, You trust the voices you, and when those voices paint a certain group as the other, you don't argue. You absorb it like water into dry soil. You build your worldview out of their bricks. But now, one act of kindness was forcing him to question the whole foundation. He found himself staring into the mirror more often, not to fix his hair, not to check his reflection, but to look deeper, to ask, who am I really, and why do I believe what I believe? He remembered the jokes he used to laugh at, the careless comments in locker rooms, at family barbecues, the eye rolls when someone mentioned the Muslim community, and it burned now. Not because someone had scolded him, but because he knew better now, and knowing better was heavy. It was like holding up a photograph of yourself, one you didn't know had been taken, and seeing something you didn't like. Not your posture or your expression, but your truth, your ignorance, raw and exposed. He started paying attention more. At work, he listened when his Muslim colleague took a phone call in another language, no longer with suspicion, but with curiosity. At the grocery store, he noticed a woman in hijab struggling to grab something from a high shelf and offered to help, not because he wanted to be a hero, because he wanted to be different. He started researching late at night when no one was watching, articles, videos, even downloaded a copy of the Quran, not because he was trying to prove anything wrong, but because a part of him wondered, what if everything I thought I knew was wrong? And with every new thing he learned, a mirror appeared, a new angle, a new reflection, and each one showed him something he had to face. He wasn't a bad person. He wasn't cruel, but he had been blind, willfully blind. And the hardest part wasn't admitting he'd misunderstood a religion. It was admitting he'd misunderstood himself, his values, his morals, his ability to think independently. He remembered a sermon from his childhood, something about removing the plank from your own eye before pointing out the speck in someone else's. Back then, it sounded like a metaphor. Now, it felt like a command. He realized that his fear had never been about Muslims. It was about losing control, about being challenged, about stepping outside the comfortable boundaries of what he was taught. And now that those boundaries were cracking, it was terrifying, but also liberating. Because what's scarier than being wrong your whole life? Realizing you still have time to get it right. And for the first time in a long time, the man in the mirror didn't look like a stranger. He looked like someone ready to change. It wasn't the words that stayed with him, it was the way the man lived. Yusuf didn't try to explain Islam. He didn't hand out pamphlets, didn't quote scripture, didn't launch into theological arguments. He never once said, "Let me tell you about my religion." But somehow, without saying it, he told everything. There was a quiet strength in him, a stillness, the kind of presence that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Yusuf walked through the world like a man who knew who he was, apologetically, not arrogantly, just firmly. His beliefs weren't decoration, they were direction. And it was in the little things, like how he always arrived on time, never flustered, never rushed, like time bowed to his discipline, how he paused everything when it was time to pray, no matter where he was. No fanfare, no announcement, just a simple excuse himself, wash up, and quietly step into a corner to connect with his creator. No shame in that, no hesitation, just obedience that looked beautiful. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. In fact, he seemed almost unaware of how closely people watched him, how much weight his actions carried. That's what made it real. That's what made it powerful. Because when a man lives his truth without performing, you start to wonder what's giving him that kind of peace. He remembered watching Yusuf one afternoon when a customer at the cafe yelled at him for no reason, angry, impatient, and loud. The kind of moment most people would snap. But Yusuf just listened, nodded slowly, and said, "I understand. I'll do my best to fix it." Calm, steady, no trace of ego, and it wasn't weakness. It was something else, something rare. It made him question his own reactions, his own pride, how quick he was to defend himself, to strike back. But Yusuf seemed free from that. Like he'd already won a war. Most people were still fighting inside themselves. And he started noticing a pattern. Yusuf never gossiped, never cursed. If someone spoke ill of others, he either changed the subject or gently walked away. When someone dropped something, he picked it up. When someone needed help, he offered before being asked. And when someone hurt him, he forgave genuinely, not just in words, but in the way he treated them afterward. It wasn't that Yusuf was perfect, he wasn't, but his flaws didn't define him, his faith did. And watching him day by day, something started to happen, a quiet revolution inside, because character like that, it sticks, it challenges you without trying to, it forces you to look at your own reflection and ask, am I living with that kind of consistency, that kind of peace? He realized something important. The most powerful form of dawah wasn't debate or doctrine. It was dignity. It was compassion. It was restraint. It was choosing patience when anger was easier. Choosing truth when a lie would have been more convenient. Choosing to pray in a world that scoffs at prayer. It was the character of a man who belonged to something deeper. And for someone who had spent most of his life running from the idea of Islam, that kind of character was disarming. It tore down walls without ever touching them. It softened a hardened heart without force. It planted questions that no lecture ever could. How could a faith that produced this kind of man be what he was taught to fear? Yusuf never tried to change it. He just lived. And that, more than anything, made him want to change himself. He hadn't planned on changing. That's the thing about transformation. It rarely starts with intent. It begins with discomfort, with quiet questions that won't go away, with a restlessness that creeps in once the old answers stop working. And after meeting Yusuf, after watching his quiet strength, his unshakable peace, that restlessness began to grow. He started seeking not because someone told him to, but because something inside demanded it. It wasn't about proving anything wrong anymore. It was about understanding, about peeling back the layers of a belief he'd spent his life avoiding, fearing, or misunderstanding. Late at night, long after the house had gone silent, he would open his laptop and search. Not the headlines, not the noise, but the words themselves. The Quran, the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The stories of those who had walked a similar path, former soldiers, skeptics, pastors, men and women who began with doubt and ended in something deeper. At first, he approached it cautiously, almost defensively. But the more he read, the more his defenses softened. There was something in the rhythm of the Quran that struck him, not just the words, but the way it spoke directly to the heart. It didn't argue like a textbook. It resonated like a mirror. It asked questions he had long buried. What do you worship? What do you run from? What will you take with you when all this ends? And then there was the prophet, so unlike the version he'd heard growing up. Not a warlord, not a tyrant, but a man of mercy. A man who forgave those who tried to kill him, who lived humbly, slept on straw mats, shared everything he had, who cried for his people and prayed for his enemies. The more he learned, the more he felt something shifting. This wasn't what he had been taught. This was something else entirely, something beautiful. The questions turned into prayers, even if he didn't know what to call them yet. God, if you're real, guide me. If this is truth, show me. And those prayers weren't met with lightning bolts or booming voices, just more clarity, more calm, like every step forward was met with reassurance. He started noticing signs, coincidences that felt too perfect to ignore, conversations that opened doors, verses that answered doubts, dreams that felt more like messages than imagination. And slowly, truth stopped feeling foreign. It started feeling familiar, like coming home to something his soul had always known but his mind had forgotten. He didn't rush it. This wasn't about impulse. It was about sincerity. Every step was deliberate, every doubt welcomed, every question honored. Because real belief isn't built on pressure, it's built on light. And after months of seeking, of learning, of wrestling and surrendering, he realized he no longer feared Islam. He loved it, not because someone convinced him, because the truth spoken. He was finally listening. It was on a quiet evening, under a sky dotted with stars, that he found himself standing in front of a mirror once again. But this time, the reflection was different. The man staring back at him wasn't the same one who had walked into Yusuf's life months ago. The doubts, the fears, the walls he had so carefully constructed, they were gone. He had sought, he had learned, and now, in this moment of clarity, he understood. He was no longer just a seeker, he was a believer. The decision to embrace Islam wasn't something that came in a dramatic, thunderous moment. It wasn't the result of an epiphany that knocked him to the ground. It wasn't the perfect answer to all of life's questions. It was simple, almost understated, a quiet conviction that settled in his chest like peace finding its rightful place. He understood now what Yusuf had shown him through his actions all along. It wasn't just about words, it was about surrender. It was about a truth so profound, so pure, that it couldn't be denied when recognized it. The Shahadah was a moment of profound humility, yet it was also one of immense strength. Saying those words, Ashhadu anna la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, wasn't a declaration of fear or doubt. It was a statement of courage. It was the courage to finally lay down the armor of ignorance, to walk away from the comfort of assumptions, and to stand in the light of truth, knowing that the journey ahead would be nothing like the one he had left behind. He spoke the words softly at first, almost to himself. He wasn't looking for applause. There were no cameras, no audience, no accolades. This was just him and his Creator. In a moment of complete surrender, as the words left his lips, they felt both new and ancient, like a song sung by a part of him that had been silent for far too long. The weight that had burdened his chest, the weight of fear and ignorance, seemed to lift with every syllable. The world didn't change overnight. The challenges didn't disappear. But something within him had shifted. His perspective had transformed. The hatred he once carried, whether for Muslims or for the unknown, was gone. It had been replaced by something more profound: understanding, empathy. No longer an other, it was home. It was truth. It was he wasn't the same man anymore. And he wasn't afraid of who he was becoming. Because with every step, he was walking closer to something more real than he had ever known. This was his new beginning. And it was just a start.